Hello, this is Professor Keith Ross from the John Jay College of Criminal Justice. Today I'm going to be talking about Chapter 2, Policing in the American Context for my Police Studies class. So basically what we're going to be talking about is how do police function in our society? So we have a couple of definitions that I think we need to go over first to sort of understand what's the environment that police do their job in. So the first definition, democracy. Democracy, root of two words, the CRAC means rule by, and demos means people. So democracy is government by the people, for the people. That people have a say in how their government operates. Now, we are not in the United States of America a true democracy because what we do is we elect officials to represent our views. So we're considered to be a representative democracy. You'll also hear a lot of times the United States of America is referred to as a constitutional democracy because not only are we governed by elected officials who represent our interests, we are also governed by a set of rules, the Constitution in this case, that sort of lays out how government operates and what it can and cannot do. So America is a representative democracy, a system of rule embracing elected officers. We, the people, elect these officers who undertake to represent the interests or views of citizens within the framework of the rule of law, which is why things are always changing depending on what the zeitgeist of society is. We're now sort of in a more progressive zeitgeist where we focus more on the rights of the individual, but these things tend to be cyclical. So in a democracy, we emphasize things like the equality of rights. We do have rights. If you guys remember the first Zoom class, that was one of the questions I asked you. Does everybody here have rights? Everyone raised their hands. The question is, do we know what our rights are? So we have the right to things like peacefully practice religion, to peacefully assemble, the right to grand juries, the right to counsel, the right to not excessive bail or excessive punishments, privileges and opportunities of the citizenry. Our government, in theory at least, is supposed to be a transparent government, meaning we elect officials to represent us, and we want to know how they're doing it, what they're actually doing when they're representing us, and why they're doing it. Right now, I try not to be too topical on these lectures because I'll probably use them in the future. But right now, we're mourning the passing of a Supreme Court Judge, Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And right now, there is an issue going on between, do we elect a new Supreme Court justice in this POTUS's President of the United States term, or do we wait until the next elected official? And we sort of had the same issue the last 4 years prior. If you notice, the two different sides have sort of swapped their opinions. So again, we want to know what our government is doing for us, how they're doing it, and why they're doing it. So we have this freedom to ask information. What is the government doing? However, the government does represent our interests, and should we know everything that the government is doing? Or are there things that maybe the government needs to hold back in the sake of national security? This is a question, you can fall on either side of it, and there are logical arguments for both. It's a personal preference, it's a personal opinion. Research the facts, research both the sides, and then come to an intelligent opinion on your own. Fifth Amendment gives us this right to due process. The American legal principle that the government must respect all the legal rights that are owed to a person according to the law. If I get accused of something, the police can arrest me, but the courts must tell me what the charges are. The courts must allow me to have counsel or must allow me to have an attorney present to argue my case. I must be able, if this goes to trial, to obtain witnesses in my own favor. Some more definitions. The definition of federalism is a political doctrine holding that power is divided between a central government body in the United States of America, that would be the federal government and the United States Constitution, and various constituent units. The states, in New York State, where I'm from, there is a state constitution. The state constitution does not have things in it that the United States Constitution would find unconstitutional. But as a New York State resident, I am afforded rights in this state. And those rights might be different in this state than they are in other states. Maybe stand your ground or castle doctrine laws are something to consider. Now, in the United States of America, we do have a federal government and we have a state government, and we also have municipal, city, or county level governments. And power is divided between those three things. Now, if we just had a federal government in power, well, that's not federalism. Basically, what that is, that's if it's ruled by one person, it's a monarchy or maybe a plutarchy, things of that nature. Confederation, a system of government that lacks a strong central authority, meaning that this is decentralization. An example of confederation might be the continent of Europe. Now, there is a European Union, however, there are separate countries with separate constitutions, separate laws, and there is no really sort of centralized European power. Some pillars of democracy, some pillars of American democracy. Sovereignty of the people, meaning that the people have the final say, either in a true democracy like ancient Greece, where every person had a vote and every person's vote counted, or in our representative democracy, where we elect officials to represent our points of view, our interests. The majority does rule. So if a majority of, let's say, Congress agrees with a certain bill, that bill will start to get passed. And then obviously the executive branch has to sign it into law. However, no matter the fact that the majority does get to sort of rule and have their opinion or their perception as the main focus, we must also take into account the rights of the minority. An example of this, let's see, maybe percentage-wise, I don't even know, but I'm assuming that percentage-wise, there are less same-sex marriages than there are non-same-sex marriages. However, just because same-sex couples are in the minority does not mean that 3 states are allowed to ban same-sex marriages. As a matter of fact, the United States Supreme Court weighed in on this and stated that that would be unconstitutional via the 14th Amendment, that the United States Constitution allows people to enjoy life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And if 2 people are in a same-sex relationship, they are allowed to have that same pursuit of happiness that a non-same-sex couple is allowed to have. And if you don't allow that, then you're in violation of the 14th Amendment. Guarantee of basic human rights. Now, this can be sort of debated as to what exactly human rights are. What exactly is that pursuit of happiness, right? In the last 10 years, there has been the debate on a national health system, whether do people in their pursuit of happiness have the right to basic health care? It's a question, and you have to, research both sides, see what both sides say about it, and then come up with your own intelligent opinion on that. Equality before the law, so that no matter what, in theory, whether you are of low socioeconomic means or of high socioeconomic means, The criminal justice system should be fair and impartial to you in however the trial goes. It's up to you whether you believe that or not. The due process of law, constitutional limits on government. We have a Fourth Amendment right to protect against governmental intrusions into our persons and our places. And that might also include, let's say, our phone calls. The Patriot Act, which is something I believe I've referenced before for this class, uh, the year after 9/11, it was enacted, and it allowed the federal government to listen to cell phone conversations in the attempts of counterterrorism. Well, that has been remanded because it was seen as a violation of the Fourth Amendment. Values of tolerance, pragmatism, cooperation, and compromise are supposed to be pillars of democracy. The next concept, and I've talked about this a little bit, but I didn't elaborate too much, the social contract. And this PowerPoint slide, there's a lot of information, and I'm going to read it verbatim. The social contract theory holds that in earliest history, man lived in a state of nature, wild. No government existed. Each man was only as secure as his own power and mental awareness could make him. By agreeing with one another to make a state by contract, doesn't have to be a written contract, this could be a verbal contract. Men within a given area join together, each surrendering some personal freedom as necessary to promote the safety and well-being of all. So we as individuals have rights, but we give up a little bit of those rights to allow society to flourish. By this contract, the members created a government. The social contract gives rights and responsibilities to citizens, people, individuals, and the government/society. For example, in the United States, citizens yield the power of prosecution of and punishment for criminal offenses to the judicial branch of government. The government, for its part, bears the responsibilities of maintaining public safety, i.e., the police, for the citizens through the police court systems, correction facilities, and all supporting structures. Here's another example of the social contract. I'm assuming most of you are aware that if you are flying on a plane, what you're going to have to do is prior to getting on that plane, you're going to have to pass a Transportation Security Administration or TSA security checkpoint. And basically what they're looking for is contraband. This could be weapons like guns, knives. It could be illegal substances. It could be corrosive substances. Now, let's just say I have a gun. The Second Amendment says that I have a gun, that I'm allowed to have a gun. I have the right to have a gun. But does the Constitution say that I have a right to fly in a plane? Does not. So if I want to fly on that plane, I'm going to give up this right of bringing that firearm on the plane. Now, why? What's the thinking behind this? Well, if I have a firearm, I could potentially be a bad guy, and I could potentially cause harm to others. By me surrendering that firearm, what are we doing? The individual is giving up some of the rights because the rest of the plane will now enjoy their pursuit of happiness going from point A to point B. Now, some of you are probably thinking, well, what happens if you are a licensed firearms owner? If you are a licensed firearms owner, you are allowed to bring a firearm on a plane, but you are not allowed to have that firearm loaded, nor are you allowed to have it on a person. I believe it has to be in a lockbox in the luggage. John Locke in The Social Contract. We give up our rights to ourselves, exacting retribution for crimes in return for impartial justice. Backed by overwhelming force, we retain the right to life and liberty and gain the right to just, impartial protection of our property and of our lives. Police and how they function in a democracy. Well, they are governed by both laws and procedures. There are things that police are allowed to do. There are things that police are not allowed to do. Are police allowed to arrest people? Yes, they are allowed to arrest people. However, when can they arrest? Well, they can only arrest if they have, quote unquote, probable cause that an offense has been committed and the person who is about to be arrested is the one who probably did it. That a reasonable person looking at the facts and circumstances of this case at the time of the point of arrest would think the person who's about to be arrested is the one who committed this offense. Again, the social contract, I just talked about that. Values placed upon human dignity. No matter what police department you're talking about in the United States of America, their very first tenant, their very first rule is to protect life, no matter what. Does not submit to the wishes of a powerful leader or party. And if you notice in the PowerPoint, I put a question mark there because we have to sort of ask ourselves, well, in theory, does this works? However, in practice, does this work? Here's an example. Right now, at least in New York City, on the books, it is still a misdemeanor to smoke a marijuana cigarette, a joint, in public. However, by the wishes of our executive branch of government on the city level, these offenses are not enforced, or not enforced in the way that they had been 10, 15 years ago. Police are publicly accountable, meaning that if police act, they have to be able to articulate what they did, how they did it, and most importantly, why they did it. Was there legal standing for them to do what they did? Consequently, in democracies, a certain amount of crime is going to be inevitable and permissible. Because, again, in the social contract between individuals and our government allows individuals to have rights and also allows government to have rights. And we have to weigh both equally. If federalism is a division of governmental power, it stands to reason that there are various law enforcement entities that act in the interest of these governmental agencies. Now, I've said in previous lectures that at least if you're a resident of New York City, you're subject to three different governments. You're subject to the government of New York City, the city county level. Then we're subject to the state of New York's rules and procedures, and also the federal government's rules and procedures and powers. So federal agencies subsidize state and local law enforcement agencies. Federal agendas and procedures can affect the way state and local law enforcement agencies conduct themselves. Well, here's an example of that. Every state in the United States of America is allowed to set speed limits on public highways. States are allowed to do the same. Now, what happens if a state decided, you know what? We're tired of the federal nanny government and we're not going to post speed limits anymore. It's up to the citizens to make a choice for themselves how fast or how slow they want to operate their motor vehicle on a city or public highway. Well, the states could do that. Now, federal government stipulate that there are minimum and maximum speed limits. Now, what happens if a state, I'm picking one out, let's just say it's New Jersey. I'm not saying New Jersey does it, I'm just using this as a hypothetical. Let's say if New Jersey decides they don't want speed limits on their public highways anymore. Well, guess what? New Jersey can do that, but there will be a consequence for this action. We all pay taxes. Taxes go to the city level, state level, and the federal level. What the federal government does is it collects taxes from all 50 states and some of the commonwealths as well. They take that money and then they subsidize infrastructure costs. So let's say the upkeep of public highways. Well, the federal government could turn around and say, okay, New Jersey, you don't want to post speed limits anymore? We understand. That's fine. As a federalist country, you have that power. However, we are not going to fund fixing your highways anymore. You will have to figure that out. So there's always going to be this push and pull between what states want to do, what cities want to do, and what the federal government wants to do. Now, I'm going to give you a scenario. I've made this scenario up. The address does not exist. So, my residents who live in Queens, specifically in Astoria and Long Island City, you can look for it, but I don't believe it exists because I made it up. So, here's the scenario. You are an active veteran police officer that has conducted and or participated in numerous drug arrests and investigations. A reliable informant, one that you have used in the past with successful results, meaning that this informant has given you credible or good information and continuously gives you good, credible information. Informs you that there is a crack cocaine operation running out of 4201 Vernon Boulevard, apartment 7B. You conduct a quick surveillance and quickly ascertain that this apartment has all the features of a crack den. There's numerous traffic in and out of the apartment at all hours. There are crack vials, those little orange bottles in the vicinity of the apartment, etc. You can also hear the cries of numerous babies inside the apartment. What do you do? Now, there are two schools of thought on this. Now, there's one school of thought that says, wow, this is a crack den and I hear a lot of babies crying. This could possibly be an emergency. Those babies could be in trouble. Now, if you are of that mindset, that you think that those babies are in trouble and we're facing a locked door, well, what do? Well, if you're thinking that there is an emergency and there is a quote unquote exigent circumstance that you need to solve in order to preserve those babies' lives, those babies' health, those babies' pursuit of happiness, you break down the door. Now, if you break down the door, well, you didn't have a warrant to do it, signed by a judge showing that you had probable cause. So you're going to have to sort of employ this emergency exception, and you're going to have to be able to articulate. Now, some of you were listening to that scenario and you understood, okay, it's a crack den, and you heard babies cry. But what do babies do? Babies cry. Does that mean that there is an emergency? Does that mean that we know that we have probable cause that there is an abusive relationship going on between any of the residents or people that are inside that apartment and those babies? If you said no, that there is not this exigent circumstance, then there means that that time is not of the essence. If time is not of the essence, you have to go to a judge, show the probable cause to enter that private residence and get a search warrant to go inside. I'm not going to say which is the right answer or not, because as a police officer, as a law enforcement official, what you need to be able to do is to articulate what you did, how you did it, and again, especially in a case like this, why you did it. So if you are of the mindset that you can break down the door because there was an emergency going on with those babies were crying, and you had to cure that emergency, that exigent circumstance. Well, what you do is you follow Herbert Packer's crime control model. Herbert Packer posited this crime control versus due process model. So in the crime control, criminal justice is sort of assembly line. It's quantity over quality, favors informality, and there is a presumption of guilt. In this case, you heard those babies crying, and what did you presume? That those kids were being abused by whoever was inside that apartment. And what are you trying to do? Well, you're trying to save babies. You're trying to benefit society. You're concerned with the ends. You didn't really care about breaking down that door. Why didn't you care about breaking down that door? Because you saw an emergency that you had to solve, that you had to cure. In this case, the lives of those babies. Maximizes police authority, controls crimes, and the emphasis is on factual guilt. I heard babies crying. This is what I thought at this time. This is why I broke down the door. Now, if you are of the mindset that, well, babies cry, that's what they do. They eat, they poop, and they cry. Well, you're probably more a proponent of the due process model, that criminal justice should be an obstacle course, that in order for police to proceed, they must jump over obstacles. They have to explain their actions. Quality over quantity prefers formality, and that there is a presumption of innocence. That just because those babies are crying does not mean that they're being abused inside that apartment. We don't know this. We need more credible information to get to that level of probable cause to take that door down. Seeks to benefit suspects, because in our criminal justice system, we are innocent until proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt in a criminal trial. Concerned with the means. Why did you break down that door, officer? Were there no other routes available to you? Protects people's rights and emphasis on legal guilt. The last part of this, roles of a police officer. Now, honestly, unless you grew up in a police household, we're mostly informed by what we see on the news and what we see in popular media. So everyone knows that one of the things that police do is that they effect arrests and they issue summonses, and the summonses are issued in lieu of arrest. They also conduct investigations. What else do police officers in New York City and all across the United States of America do? Well, here's some of them. They render medical aid. Oftentimes, at least in New York City, New York City cops will get what's called a 1054 or an aided case, meaning that a person has been injured. So they're going to respond, and maybe the person is bleeding. Uh, Police are equipped nowadays with tourniquets. So, I mean, if it's bad bleeding and EMS is not there, or the fire department and paramedics are not there, well, police might have to render aid. They might have to do breathing, things like that. They protect people and property. They provide directions. One of the things that police officers do on a day to day basis, especially patrol officers that respond to quote unquote radio runs, meaning the radio, meaning Central gives them out jobs, is that they solve people's problems. It is very rare that a citizen will call 911 and say, I don't have a problem, Central. I just want the cop to come over and say hi, maybe have a cup of coffee, or I'm having Thanksgiving dinner. It's only when people are in crisis do they call 911. And what they're asking police to do is to help them solve an issue that they cannot solve on their own. They can be marriage counselors, depending on the command that you work in. You might have a lot of DV or domestic violence cases. And domestic violence cases does not always mean physical issues. This could just mean verbal disputes. They can be social workers. Oftentimes, in child abuse cases, it is police that will remove a child from an abusive household and then place them into protective custody. Director of referrals, housing court, Safe Horizon for domestic violence victims, things of that nature. Community outreach, and especially in 2020 with things that have been going on between police and people that are questioning how police do things and what they do and why they do it. There are community affairs officers reaching out to the community to try and solve some of these issues, to institute dialogue and communication. Something that I did for half my career, I was a trainer, meaning I trained other police. I trained recruit police officers. I also trained detectives and supervisors, and I trained trainers as well. Giving legal advice. If you are a New York City resident, you've probably seen at least a few parades. Well, there are musicians, there are artists, there are photographers, videographers, ceremonial functions, things of that nature. In today's society, we ask police to do a lot. What are factors that can influence, impede, and or assist how police officers conduct themselves? Physical boundaries, meaning that there are precinct boundaries and jurisdictional boundaries. If I work, let's say, in the 114th precinct, I'm responsible for jobs in the 114th precinct. I am not responsible for the adjoining commands, let's say the 108 precinct and the 115th precinct, which are the two bordering commands of the 114th. That doesn't mean I can't do anything in those commands, but I'm not responsible for that. So I mean, if I'm responding to a police call for help, a 1013, a 1085, and I'm near that boundary, absolutely I can pass that boundary. Um, Jurisdictional boundaries. If I am a NYPD police officer, I am allowed to effect an arrest in New York City, and by extension, depending on what the offense is, usually felonies, I can effect an arrest in New York State. So if I'm not in my quote unquote geographical area of employment, i.e., the five boroughs, I'm off duty and I witness, let's say, an armed robbery taking place, and I have my firearm on me, I can effect that arrest. However, if let's say, I fly out to California to go to Los Angeles, I can't effect an arrest. I have no jurisdictional responsibility or power in Los Angeles. And even with that, there are some times where I actually could. If I observed a person committing an offense in New York and they hop into a vehicle and I follow them from New York to California and I don't lose sight of them, or I only momentarily lose sight of them, and then I find them in Los Angeles, well, then I could effect an arrest based on close pursuit laws of New York State. Legal boundaries, constitutions, the United States Constitution, the New York State Constitution, the New York City Charter, and New York State Penal Law, New York State Vehicle and Traffic Law, New York City Administrative Code, New York City Health Code, New York City Sanitation Code. These are all things that I have legal responsibility. However, if I'm in Delaware, if I'm in New York and someone has Delaware plates, I can't write a summons and tell them that they are responsible to go to Delaware court for it because I don't have any jurisdiction. I don't have any legal authority to issue a summons in Delaware. Human dimensions, how the citizenry views their police, if they approve or they disapprove, if they're empathetic to the police cause or they are apathetic to the police cause. And right now, we're definitely sort of in a state of crisis as to how certain factions of citizens view their police. Some are empathetic, some are apathetic. Both might have valid points. And again, this is something that you need to weigh. Political concerns, influence of appointers, let's say the mayor, the city council. Right now, one of the big issues going on is defund the police. Whether it makes sense to you or not, these are issues that are being brought up due to political concerns of how police conduct themselves. Political tide in 9/11, 2001, and maybe 1 year, 2 years after that, most citizens were very, very pro-police. In the present day, I would say citizens are critical of their police. Media concerns, influence of public perception of the police, primetime news organizations. What is a news organization's stake in reporting the news? Are they more concerned with reporting the news impartially and objectively, or are they more concerned about generating advertising dollars? This is a question, and examine both sides of it again. I don't want to give my opinion on that. Release of information by police to media. Well, how much information do they release and why are they releasing that information? And is there a conflict with police releasing information to the media? Comes back to that idea of democracy and transparent government and how transparent our government and the agencies under our government actually are. And managing the impression. If you look at the NYPD's Twitter account, they're very careful in how they sort of manage how police are being perceived by the citizens. And they want to sort of focus more on the positive interactions. A lot of times in the media, we see more negative reactions between citizens and police. And there could be questions, well, why is that? Human dimensions, how the police view themselves. Some police view themselves specifically as crime fighters. Some police view themselves as community advocates. Some police view themselves as a mixture of both. There are union issues, right to work, meaning in the NYPD, they have a union that represents their interests. That's called the New York City I think it's Patrolmen's, I think they might have changed their name, not sure. Patrolmen's Benevolent Association, the PBA. The PBA represents our NYPD's interests, especially when we're talking about contract issues. Not every police department has a union that represents them. So NYPD is unionized. Other jurisdictions are not unionized. If they're not unionized, that's called right to work, meaning that you could be fired for anything without due process, without showing just cause. In the NYPD, you don't just get fired for whatever happens. You are allowed that due process. So these issues talk about contracts, wages, health benefits, things like that. Legislative influence, laws influencing, affecting how police go about their business. Judicial influences, debating, enforcing, affecting change on how police go about their business. For my corrections class, they'll be examining that issue with bail reform laws. And lastly, we're going to talk about professional organizations within police departments. These associations are used for fraternal get togethers, networking opportunities. They're usually based on pride, common interests, things of that nature. They could be things like race, like in the NYPD, there is a Guardians Association. What do the Guardians do? Well, they represent the interests and issues of African American police officers. The Columbia Association addresses issues of Italian born or Italian descent officers. Religious organizations, let's say the Holy Name Society in the NYPD, represents the interests of Catholic police officers. Sexual orientation in the NYPD, that is GOAL. They represent same sex and intersex and transsex persons within the NYPD. I can tell you that I'm a member of a couple of fraternal organizations. I'm half Italian, so I'm a member of the Columbia Association. I'm also a member of a non-for-profit police organization called Smoking Shields. What Smoking Shields is, you have to be law enforcement and you have to like smoking cigars. I am both. So I'm a member of that. And we represent our interests and we do a lot of things. We send cigars to soldiers overseas. We conduct charity events for the Widows and Orphans Funds, things of that nature. Gives people a sense of belonging, a sense of empowerment, a sense of fraternity. And sometimes these can be researching and or informational. That concludes chapter 2 for my police studies class. I wish you guys all a great day. Take care.